a documentary where we see the different points of view from a few professors when it comes to English grammar. The first professor we choose to give us his opinion is...
Hello again. So they invited me to talk about grammar and talk about the most important activities teaching grammar and the difficulties I perceive as a teacher when I teach grammar. In terms of the most important activities, I would say any activities that invite students to use grammar in context. The worst thing that we can do sometimes is simply develop a grammar point for the sake of developing a grammar point. Instead, you have to provide activities that invite people to use grammar and use it for something that matters. So instead of giving a handout, have them create a video, have them write in a blog, have them make a poster, or anything that has them play with grammar and play with the grammar points, because that's what creates meaningful learning. Now, when it comes to teaching grammar, what difficulties have I perceived? On the one hand, I think it's the overall position of grammar. Like, people think of grammar and they think of this thing that is dry, that is not necessary, that is impossible to learn, that is difficult to learn, and they come with this mentality when you're going to try to work a grammar point. How can you overcome those problems? Simple. Talk to them about why grammar is important. Show them examples of in real life how people sometimes, by misusing grammar, they end up getting themselves into a lot of trouble. And how embarrassing it is when you write a text message for someone else to read that has bad grammar. All that basically could be the topics. Some topics are more difficult to get than others. Some people have trouble with conditionals, some people have trouble with the use of clauses, the use of models, but again, it goes back to what I said in the first question. If you provide a meaningful environment and a good context to develop the activities, that should help people get over the grammar mistakes and at least understand why grammar is important. Sometimes your job is not to correct the grammar mistakes, but to point out why grammar matters. And if you can do that, your students can realize that they need to work on the grammar by themselves. That's a step forward.
We will be listening to a Professor Juan Diego Martinez, who is going to tell us about the general methodology that he used to teach English grammar.
Alright, my name is Juan Diego Martinez. I'm a professor at the Faculty of Education at UPB, and few of my students have asked me about the difficulties I've found when I'm teaching English grammar. Well, I would probably say that there are loads of difficulty dealing with that. But the first difficulty I would certainly mention is that we Colombians do not know anything about our own language. So mostly I would believe that the biggest difficulty we've got is dealing with our own language knowledge. I mean, we don't know anything about our structures, tenses, forms. Either we don't know anything about the categories we use in Spanish. So I'm going to start saying that first. Second, talking about the English grammar itself is like there are many theories about teaching grammar. There's some methods about teaching grammar, but there's a traditional one, which is a grammar approach. And most of the people, when teaching grammar, they use the grammar approach, and it, let's say, produces an effect which is not contextualized. So grammar out of context, out of meaning, not certainly context, but out of meaning, is useless, because knowing a code without knowing what the code would mean or the use or the form of the code would be a waste of time. There are some other difficulties like processes for learning, some other subjects combining the grammar, proposal, and others. The second part of the question they have asked me about is what have I done for solving this kind of situation? And actually I have done many things. And the institution as well. We've got a course called Comparative Linguistics, and in here what we try to do is to analyze the difference between Spanish and English on a basic level. But the idea is not comparing the languages with each other, but the idea is to find out what makes them different. So in that sense, you certainly learn based on the different aspect of the language, but not the common aspect of the language. So we try to teach grammar not as a traditional effect, but as a way to find out the difference. And how do we make it meaningful is first we used, let's say, what we've got in context to find it out how useful it would be. I mean, if I would teach them what a noun is in terms of categories, as I did it with you, the idea would be recognizing what a noun is, not only in English but in Spanish, but at the same time you would have the possibility to recognize it, analyze it, get the meaning and the use of it. So in that sense you will certainly learn, appropriate the concept and the use. We have done many ways to manage to get the language structures, and here at the faculty we were based on some other modules and competences and courses. There's lots of different names, but what we tried to do is that we combine this first module with grammar, with the component which is going to be Competencia Comunicativa 1, and in that sense they will certainly find out what is going to be the utility the language has.
Grammar of a foreign language, there are many difficulties. The main difficulties are based on the differences between the structures of a language in reference to the other language. In the case of Spanish, we have many differences. English is a Saxo-German language which has different forms of expression, and English is a very simple language in reference to the Spanish grammar. The English grammar is not difficult, it's different, and that's the main point which the teacher has to have in mind when he is going to teach English grammar. One of the most common activities or procedures which the teachers use to teach grammar is giving rules, but it is dangerous because the behavior and the typology of the two languages is really very different. So the best way to teach English structures in reference to Spanish structures is to try to teach first the conflictive structures. It means structures which don't exist in Spanish. For example, Spanish has subjunctive, and it's very clear the use of subjunctive in Spanish because the verbs in Spanish have many forms and many times, like present, past, copretérito, postpretérito, subjuntivo, and many other names that they use in these verbs. In English, there are not so many forms. English has only two forms. One is present and the other is past. When English is going to use, for example, a subjunctive form, can do it using a specific form which is used, for example, in Spanish. In English, you have to use a substitute form so that the student can assimilate the forms of these, digamos, substitution for subjunctive in English. Let me give you an example. Quiero que vengas. In Spanish it's a very common form and direct form of expressing some kind of desire, some kind of relationship between present and future. In English you can't do that. In English you have to use a substitute and you have to use the help of another verbs. For example, you have to say, I want you to come. What are you doing there? You are using the infinitive as a substitute of the Spanish subjunctive. In this form, the student has to understand that he can't find a real form of subjunctive, but he must use the structure which is designed to express that in English, more or less, approximately, because they are not exact forms which coincide with English and Spanish, and so on. There are many, many difficulties. The splits, for example, the difference between a serie estar in Spanish have only one form in English, the verb be. Many other, the use of prepositions, the use of the special structures, the use of idioms, and the use of the defined structures which belong to any or the other language, or the one or the other language. In that case, the best, let's say, the best form to solve these problems, to overcome these difficulties, is to make an inventory of forms. Which are the forms in English? Which are the forms in Spanish? How are they expressed in English? And to know the differences and the conflict which they represent for a Spanish speaker.